Hello everyone and welcome to Flight Club. My name is Klaus Leopold and I'm the co-host of the show. And yeah, with me is the other host, which is Cliff. Over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Yes, so my name is Cliff, as Klaus said, and tonight we have a wonderful show in store for you. I want to tell you a little bit about what we're up to and what we've been doing since we last spoke, because it's been a few weeks since our last episode. So we've actually been busy with a number of things at the Flight Levels Academy. We've launched our first online workshop. It's an entirely self-paced online course. We'll tell you a little bit more about it at the end, and there'll even be a discounted code available for you if you're interested in trying it out. We, of course, have a wonderful guest. Julia Wester is joining us from, actually, this is the first time we have a guest from in Sweden. This is quite cool. So we're both technically on the same internet in some way. So yeah, we have Julia Wester who's joining us, and we'll give a good introduction to her in a minute. And of course, I want to remind everybody, if at any point you're enjoying the content, please hit like. It really does help us in terms of building the content and getting other people to see what's happening. And of course, if you want to stay in the loop about what's happening with the Flight Levels Academy, as well as with Flight Club, please hit the subscribe button. If you hit the little bell on the next, just next to it, you will also get announcements for future events as well. Cool. So now that my preamble is over, I want to say hello to everybody who is on the live stream. We've had a couple of people saying hi. It's wonderful to see you all here. We've got greetings from all over the world. It's really nice to have you all joining us today. We hope that you enjoy the show. So I want to introduce you to our guest, Julia Wester. We actually met for the very first time via Twitter and then in person at Lean Agile Scotland last year. I think it was in October. We finally got a chance to talk face to face and in person. But Julia, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you've been up to and what brings you to Sweden?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, my name is Julia Wester. As Cliff gave away, I am living in Sweden now, but obviously from my accent, you can tell I'm not quite native. I moved here from Seattle a little over a year ago. And while Cliff is in Stockholm, I think, I am in southern Sweden, near Malmö and across the bridge from Copenhagen. But what I've been doing for a while now is my company, 55 Degrees. We are a consulting and software company here in southern Sweden. We acquired ActionableAgile analytics. So I've been spending a lot of time continuing the work that I've been doing in the past, helping people with flow and analyzing their flow and improving their flow. But now, more often than not, using this software and helping people understand what it means to analyze flow metrics and how that can help them make their work life better, essentially. And so hopefully today we'll be talking about some of that.
Very cool.
Awesome.
So before we get too much into the questions, I want to give a little bit of an overview. So for those of you who are wondering what to expect for today, we're going to talk a little bit about what is forecasting, what questions can it help answer, and how that would be helpful to us. We want to explore a little bit of how does this look when you're working with flight levels, specifically when you're looking at flight level 2. Is this different? Is there something that's special that you need to do, and what would that look like? And what do we do? A famous question is, what do we do when we don't like the result we get from our forecast? I think this will be an interesting one. Cool. So, Julia, are you ready for the first question? We might as well get started.
Absolutely.
Cool. Maybe just to kick it off, we can start a little bit with. So we're talking about forecasting and specifically probabilistic forecasting. Could you give us a little bit of a, what is this concept? What's important about it to you?
Yeah. Okay. So probabilistic forecasting is a way to help us find answers to really important questions about how long it will take us to do things, when we can deliver bodies of work, etc., how many things we can get done in a time period. It helps us answer these questions in environments that have a lot of uncertainty. So if we had all the information we needed and things were very certain and repeatable without a lot of variation, then we wouldn't need extravagant ways to answer these questions. We could just come up with, it'll be done on this date, and that's that. But we don't work and live in certain environments where everything is exactly the same all the time. So we have to find ways to answer those questions and still be true to that acknowledgement. And so that's what probabilistic forecasting can help us do. Instead of coming up with one answer to that question, that's the only answer that we ever consider, like it'll take us 10 days to do this, no questions answered. We can look at what we've done in the past, and we can say, based on that, we have a certain confidence that we'll get something done in a certain time period or less. And so a probabilistic forecast has two components. It has a likelihood or a probability, and it has a range. Just so if I were to ask the question or try to answer a question, how long will it take me to get a piece of work done? A probabilistic forecast would sound something like this. It would sound like 85% of the time we get items done in 10 days or less. So 85% is the probability. There's an 85% chance I'll get this thing done in 10 days or less, and that's the range. So I'm not saying it's taking exactly 10 days, but it'll take somewhere up until that, because usually we're happy for things to be faster, but we want to know the outbound, right? So those are the two pieces of a probabilistic forecast, a likelihood or probability and a range.
Cool. So this is probabilistic forecasting, and a lot of people do estimation, of course, right? What is the difference between forecasting and estimation?
The way that I think about it, and I don't pretend that I always think of the only right way to think of something. But when I think of someone who's trying to estimate, in my mind, what I see people doing is trying to come up with that deterministic answer of, here's the amount of time it will take. And to do that, one, takes a long time. We start doing things like, what's the work breakdown of this effort? How long will each piece take? And when we do all of these things and we start giving these very specific answers, we build up this false certainty in that specific answer because we're being very specific, so therefore we must know what we're talking about. And there's a lot of things that are unquantifiable because we just don't know what we don't know, right? And this goes back to, do we work in uncertain environments or not? So I find that estimation can be a really good process to go through to think about your work and to understand what that is. And a lot of these things that you do to come up with an estimate are good thinking processes. But if I want to answer a question for someone about when something that would be done, I feel much more confident giving a probabilistic forecast instead of a deterministic estimate, because I'm being more honest about the possible outcomes. If that makes sense.
It sounds, it sounds to me like a lot of this is focusing on sort of a situation of, if we have some kind of uncertainty or maybe some variables beyond our control, then it makes sense that we should perhaps do some forecasting rather than just estimating or guessing.
Yeah. I mean, do you see this too, where I think lately I've been thinking more and more that the real crux of a lot of our issues is that we, despite what we say and all the rhetoric, we don't act like we're really embracing that uncertainty is our reality. Do you see people acting like that? I mean, is that something that you feel like you're looking around and seeing a lot?
I feel like it might be ironic if I give a definite answer to that question. But yes, I think I see it all the time, and I think at some level, like it's uncomfortable to think that something that we're really invested in is somehow has a possibility that it could be not so successful or even completely unsuccessful. And so if we want to, as humans, kind of work with this stuff and acknowledge that reality, that's probably the first part to overcome. So the technical practice of how do we do forecasting, that's one thing, but even believing that it's necessary in the first place, perhaps that's the bigger challenge in some level.
And actually, I can understand it, that people want to have somehow this certainty. So we are doing the product launch, I don't know, on date X. So I can't live with the answer, yes, maybe we are done. or Christmas is on the 24th or 25th. So what do we do about this?
Yeah, well, I think that the question you have to ask and the way you go about answering that question are different in different scenarios. So essentially, when I'm trying to ask, when will this thing be done? That's a different question than what can I get done by this date? You know, they're related, but they're not exactly the same question. I mean, I can't remember what that triangle is called, you know, the project management triangle or whatever, where you've got your scope.
It's the triangle of doom.
You know, all of that. I mean, there is truth to that, right? If your date is fixed, you have to play with something else. We can't move Christmas, right? So we might have to change our plans about what we can get done for Christmas time. It's the same exact thing with work. You know, it just is. I have a slide of something that I put in, I don't know if you're able to show that, something that I put in a blog post that I wrote recently about if you want to be successful, you have to embrace uncertainty. And Stephen Bungay and the Art of Action, that's a really good book for me to help me really understand what you need to think about to decide whether you're in certain environments or uncertain environments. And he talks about these three gaps and, you know, and the things that we realize we don't know. So we have this outcome we want to achieve, and so we make plans to achieve it. But there's this knowledge gap, this difference between what we like to know and what we actually know, right? And then between our plans and the things that people do, there's this alignment gap. That difference between what we want them to do and what they actually do. And then even when we do the action the same over and over and over again, our circumstances aren't always identical. So sometimes, despite our best efforts, the effect of our actions is sometimes different than we want. And so if we realize that we can't know everything that we're ever going to need to know to make a perfect plan, then we're in uncertainty, right? And if we can't control the way everyone executes our plan, we're in uncertainty. If we can't control the impact that every action we take has, we're in uncertainty, right? And that's the whole point of the Agile manifesto, and things like the Scrum framework. These are techniques and ways that said, okay, we can't make a perfect plan up front. It's just not possible. Things are going to have to emerge over time. And if we embrace that and we say, hey, we need Agile, then we can't go back and then say, we need it over here, we're in uncertainty over here, but yet I want to give you a perfect deterministic forecast. It doesn't work. So that's going back to, you know, do you really accept uncertainty? You're doing Agile, so maybe you need to look at all the other things in your practice and make sure those techniques work for uncertain environments as well. And you're not just trying to take really certain approaches and stick them in an uncertain environment and beat your head against them all the time.
Yeah,
I really like that, and I want to give an extra +1 on that book. It's an excellent book. I linked it in the chat for anyone who's interested to see. Quick reminder to everybody, I see a couple of folks already asking questions in the chat. Please try to ask as many questions as you have in the chat. We'll try to weave them into this conversation as much as possible as we go.
I think we can already,
super cool.
Can we already take the first question in? Because I think it somehow fits to where we currently are. So Manuela,
if you're ready, I'm ready.
Cool. Manuela Part is asking, which metrics do you use and what are the differences on the flight levels?
That's a great question. I learned a lot from Troy McGinnis, who's actually here on this live stream today as a participant. I've learned a lot from him about metrics. So there are some baseline metrics that I always suggest, some basic flow metrics like, you know, throughput, cycle time, work in process levels, and work item aging. That's like going to the doctor and getting your blood pressure and your temperature checked, right? Those are just sort of baseline metrics that you do every time. But depending on what your situational needs are, you know, then you determine what other metrics you need or what other tests you might need to run to help you have holistic health, right? So, you would never go into your doctor and they would say, okay, we're going to run all these tests and then talk to you about what your problem is. It comes first, right? They talk to you about what your problem is and then they decide what tests you need. So I think to go back to that, there are a few baseline things, but if someone tells you right up front, you need this, 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 and this, I would make sure they really understand your context. What do you think, Klaus?
Yeah. I mean, makes totally sense to me. So Troy just says, and I want to add this, great answer. So what else can we say? Maybe I will have one or two comments on the question on which flight level you're using some metrics. So I mean, that's just my take on this. But what I see when you are more like on a flight level 1 and on a flight level 2, it's more about output metrics. So it's more about, okay, when will it be done? It's like lead time, cycle time, it's throughput. So this is somehow important. And the higher you are on the flight level, like for instance on flight level 3, it's also quite important that we talk a lot about the value actually that we are trying to achieve. So it's basically, I mean, I don't say that you don't talk about these things on flight level 1, but on flight level 3, that's actually essential. So in terms of probabilistic forecasting, like I see it more on a flight level 2 kind of basis. I mean, that's just my understanding of it. Anything to add from your side?
No, I totally agree with you. And I had forgotten to speak to the flight levels. I mean, I think in principle, you can do probabilistic forecasting at any flight level. The data that you feed in will determine what you're forecasting. So if you want to forecast things on flight level 1, you're probably forecasting based on the rate at which you finish stories or, things like that. But if you're looking at higher flight levels, you can use the same techniques, the same kinds of simulations to forecast, but you're feeding in a higher order type of data, whether it's projects or epics or portfolio items, whatever you look at. From a probabilistic forecasting perspective, same technique, but the data you put in will allow you to determine what you can forecast. So you need to forecast apples to apples. If you try to say, I finished 20 stories, so that means I can finish 20 epics, that's not really what it tells you, right? It needs to be a good comparison. The value thing, that's something we don't talk about enough, because a lot of times when we're dealing with Kanban systems or basic flow metrics, we're assuming the value has already been determined, and we're not talking about that a lot. So yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Yes,
and I guess you just gave an answer to a question from Bernd Kudike. Hi Bernd, you are a constant watcher of this stream, which is cool. So Bernd was asking, like, is the size of work you forecast similar or mixed, like elephants and mouses? And I've just heard it should be not maybe elephants and elephants, or apples and apples, and mouses, or oranges and oranges, right? So the answer is no.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
That's a good question. So the rough mix of what you are using to forecast should roughly resemble the data that you're trying to forecast for the future. So I could look at all of my work together, a mix of epics and stories and everything, right? And I could use that to forecast my entire collection of work in the future.
Okay.
Right? But the wider variety, the more variance it's going to have, and maybe the wider percentile confidences. When we really get that question, a lot of times people are asking, even in the same flight level, and say in flight level 1, if I'm trying to forecast my stories, do all my stories need to be the same size? Do things need to be exactly the same for this to work? And the answer is no, because trying to make that trying to make all your work the same causes way more problems than it ever tries to fix in the first place. And that's just not reality. So the general rule of thumb is if the mix of conditions that existed when you generated your historical data are roughly similar to the conditions you'll have when you deliver new work, then you can use that. It sort of all works out in the wash. That's what I would say in the Southeast US. Yeah.
Cliff, I can't hear you. Can you hear Cliff?
Now you can hear me.
Yes.
Oh, I can hear you.
Turns out there's a mute button in Skype that you have to push. Yeah, apparently I'm not so smart today. It seems to be a continuing trend. I was going to say, you were talking a little bit about the different types of data you need and talking about sort of the variability in terms of size, like lots of big items and small items. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of data do you think would be useful if you were trying to get, say, a set of forecasts going on level 2? The question kind of for me comes from often what I hear people saying is like, we're not yet fully able to do effective forecasting and that sort of thing, but we could at least gather some data in the meantime. So what kind of data would you recommend start gathering?
Yeah. So in ActionableAgile and in Troy's spreadsheets that people use to also do Monte Carlo forecasting, or Monte Carlo simulation, sorry. Generally, we're using just the throughput, the items, number of items complete in a given time period. And, what those items are might differ from
You disconnected.
then that.
Oh, there we go.
Julia's back.
Sorry, you disconnected for a second. Yeah.
You were frozen.
Oh, no. Okay, I was just saying that throughput, the rate of items finished in a given time period, is the data that we use to do Monte Carlo simulations. You can use any rate, but throughput is by far the easiest rate to come up with because all you have to do is finish work to get that done. You don't have to do anything else. And
which is not so easy.
True. But it takes no additional time on top of doing the work to generate that data. And so at every flight level, things are finishing, just different orders of things. And Troy has always said, when I have learned from him, 7 to 11 items is a decent enough sample size in most cases. In ActionableAgile, we throw a warning if you don't have 10 finished items, just so you know that, hey, you might need a little bit more data to be super confident. So it takes a lot less data than people think to be able to forecast. So they might think, I don't have months worth of data, so I can't really forecast yet. But, really, you don't need a lot. That said, going back to that rule of thumb and getting a little ahead into like, how can you trust a forecast? If you have 10 items and they don't have a good variety of all the things that you're going to be doing, then you might need a little bit more data to have a pretty solid forecast. But if that 10 items has a rough mix of what you're going to be doing, then that might be sufficient. So there's a lot of, it doesn't take much, but consider these things. Yeah.
Sounds like it's not too complicated to be able to gather some of that data. And I think it's interesting when we talked a little bit about estimation earlier, but I worked with a company that was doing a bunch of timesheets and reporting and so on. And one of the things that I found fascinating was just the sheer volume of time that people were spending on it. And I couldn't understand that it was necessarily going to be worth the effort that people were putting in. So we did a little bit of back of the napkin calculation, and I chatted to the CFO and said, are you aware that you're spending somewhere between 7 and 10% of the company's capacity to fill in these timesheets? Are they worth that much to you? And of course, his answer was, well, it was expletive no, not just no. And very shortly afterwards, timesheets started disappearing, and instead using something like this kind of stuff to say, well, how much time did we spend on it is one of the things they were trying to look at, but more, when would it be done and what's actually happening in the organization. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it makes a difference if you're trying to charge billable hours to someone, then timesheets might be worth it. But finding the best way to get the easiest way to get a good answer is good.
The funny thing was the way that they started accounting for it down the line was basically just to say, we did 15 things in the last week. So we probably spent, proportionately equal amounts across those things. And that was accurate enough for them, which is far, far cheaper. Very similar to what you were saying. Just gather, when do you start, when do you finish, and how many do you finish per period of time? Now you have some data and you can start to forecast. It's not very expensive to get going.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about, we talked a little bit about uncertainty earlier, and we said there were a couple of things, we need to somehow embrace that this is a reality. One of the challenges of this uncertainty, obviously, is that we get a forecast that tells us something we either don't want to hear or we don't like the result of. I've seen this once or twice before. What do you do in this situation? How do you handle it?
Yeah, that's challenging because you're going to get that. There's just answers that we don't like, and we're never going to get away from sometimes that being the case. There's a piece of advice about what you can do, and a bit of advice about a conversation you can have. So first I'll start with a conversation. At least in my opinion, I advise people to approach it like this. To talk to the people that are having the issue with the forecast and say, okay, what we did in the past gives us this result. So and what we did in the past means like up till today, right? Potentially. So if we want a different result, what are we tactically going to do differently to get a different outcome starting now? Because that's the only way that we're really going to have a different result, right? Is if we do something different, because our history is telling us that what we've done so far gets us this. You don't want that? What can we do to change that, right? And that could be change scope. That could be, all kinds of things. That's where the project management stuff sort of comes into play. And then another thing that you can do is say, well, don't just take my word to trust this, right? However you forecasted or estimated in the past, do that. But also do this alongside that and see what works out better. Better meaning as accurate but easier, or a more accurate answer, one or the other. Either way, you're getting as good an answer or better with the same or less effort. And I call that a win, right? And personally, I'm not invested in I don't need this to work out best for you. I need you to get the best answer, but I want you to prove it to yourself which one is the right way. And if a different way turns out to be better, then please, by all means, do that, right? I'm not trying to get you to do this no matter what. So, yeah, what do you tell people when people don't like the answers? What do you have any other suggestions or ways you approach that?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on the circumstances, but I've seen this sort of thing quite often, is that, well, the evidence is showing us that it can't be done by then. It's like, well, we have to do it by then. And usually the challenge is that there's some hidden variable that's being traded off in those kind of situations. And most commonly, my experience is that it's either quality or maintainability. And the challenge is that if they're not forecasting or not measuring any of those kind of things, I think quality, for example, is extremely hard to measure. Maintainability is also quite hard to measure. We cut some corners today, and yeah, we get it out by Christmas, as Klaus was saying. Christmas is the same day every year kind of thing. But at what cost? And what is the penalty down the line? So I think there's often a conversation to have about some of the underlying things and what are the other assumptions maybe that are not being brought to light. Yeah.
And I think, if you continue to cut those corners, then eventually it'll be harder and harder to finish work as, the thing grows in complexity and you can't work on it as fast, or it's harder to deploy or whatever. Eventually, probably too late, you'll start seeing that in your throughput. The amount of work you finish over time will start to decrease. And, so yeah, it's better to catch that earlier, but it will definitely come out in the metrics one way or another if you start cutting corners.
I've seen it very often that a company will start measuring something, and then almost immediately you'll see that number somehow start going up, whether that's story points or NPS or whatever other metric you choose to use.
Yeah.
And usually what happens in my experience is that if you dig a little bit behind it, the people who were measuring that number are somehow incentivized by the performance of that number. I had this at a previous company I worked at. NPS was a sort of a target metric that was governing people's bonuses. And somehow we found ways to justify removing negative responses because, well, that person canceled this month and this person did something else and they've always been an unhappy customer and they're not representative of the base. And you start to filter this out, or like you take your stories and you chop them up into smaller pieces or something like this. I'm curious what you think about sort of the incentive side of what's sitting behind this. Is like part of the challenge is as soon as you start measuring it, it's a little bit like, I guess, Schrodinger's cat in a way. We don't really know what's happening until we look at it, and then we look at it, and that somehow determines or influences the state. What's your thoughts?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. First of all, I love this particular part of the metrics conversation. So I think it was Deming who said, give a manager a target and they'll destroy the organization to meet it, right? That number will look good, but everything else might be totally trashed along the way. And we see that whether it's conscious or subconscious, once people know you're measuring something, you're telling them that's important. And so they're going to do stuff to try to make that look great, right? And it's not always with a negative intent, but this is where we have to sort of become system thinkers and look at the unintended consequences of the things we do, because it's really easy to look for the intended consequence of measuring something. But we have to be vigilant and actively look around and see what unintended consequences we're causing. And one of the ways that that we can do that, you'll hear lots of people talk about me, Larry Maccheroni, again, Troy McGinnis, about sort of measuring things that are in tension with each other. So if you're measuring throughput because you want to deliver value more often, and you want to make sure no one's killing the organization to make that look good, then measure quality, something else that will sort of pull against that speed and keep it at the right level. And so every metric that you measure, you want to think, well, how could I know if I'm hurting things by trying to make this look too good, and measure something in opposition. And then if you put that all in, say, one dashboard, then it's a lot easier. I'm not going to say it's really easier, but it makes it a lot easier to see those interplays between, like, if you see this one go up, you can see, okay, did anything else go down? And you don't have to go looking for that and try to piece things together. So I mean, I think that's really important. And I think of it, Cliff, you live in Sweden, so the concept of lagom, which is sort of like the perfect equilibrium and the place of best contentment between sort of two extremes. And so that's sort of what we're trying to find in our system, is that perfect balance, that lagom. And thinking about tension is such a great tool to help us do that, and to help us keep that, to keep a balanced, essentially.
I like that. I mean, I think when we were preparing, we were talking about this in the sense that a lot of this is kind of about the conversations that people have rather than just the data points. It's sort of the process of figuring out what to even forecast and what's factored in. That's really, I think, where a lot of the value comes from in that process. I want to jump across to a question we have from
There
Rita.
are so many.
Rita, so many great questions. We're going to have to pick up the pace if we want to cover all of them.
Okay.
But Rita Goodbody is asking, do you use any capacity allocations to determine different types of work? And I guess and if not, what do you use instead would be sort of the added piece to that. Well, what are your thoughts?
I'm thinking about that. I don't use any capacity allocation per se. While I think about that more, do either of you use any capacity allocation? It sounds good, sounds like it would be helpful, but I've not found a way to make that effective.
Yeah, same here. So, Cliff?
No, I mean, I think very often
I thought you wanted to say something. Sorry. No, I just totally agree to Julia. I also don't find it too helpful, actually. But Cliff, did you want to say something? Sorry.
I think capacity allocation ends up being a little bit like an estimate. And what I would rather do is use data of what's actually happened in the past. If we say that our throughput is historically X, that's somehow telling us a little bit about what our capacity is. And I think people often kind of get too concerned about, oh, but there's one person is on holiday and somebody else is working on this other thing. Sure, but at some point in time, I mean, you can get really fancy about it, but at least if you take it in aggregate over time, it probably, as you said, kind of all comes out in the wash. Klaus, you have a question from Adam.
I think, hi Adam, by the way. I think it somehow fits to capacity allocation a little bit. So Adam is asking, what do you tell people when they say they want to throw more resources, at the problem to accelerate the forecast? Good one.
That's a really great question because, in a lot of the tools, you can play what if scenarios to see what would happen if I add a person, and people will automatically assume that means doubling the amount of throughput that you have. But I mean, when's the last time we added a team member and doubled our and added if we're a one-person team, effectively doubling that throughput? We don't, right? Because when there's training, there's getting people up to speed, there's coordination costs now. So, maybe if you're lucky, it's like 1.75. So I do think that when you're adding just a little bit of capacity, especially if you don't have a lot, you can make some gains. And there's no magic number where that turns sort of upside down that I'm aware of. But at some point, you get diminishing returns on the throwing people on the problem thing. And Klaus, in the Twig, in the work in progress, too many ways to say it. I mean, you even have a rule that after the third person that you try to say swarm on something, right, which is effectively another way to think about this, there's diminishing returns, right? Because we're trying to teach this. So what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the point. So if 10 people are working on one task, you are most likely not 10 times faster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the 10x movement.
Yeah.
Always just throw 10 people on it and, have a baby in 1 month. So,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the irony is it probably would take more than 10 or 15 people to make a baby in 1 month, but if that were even, no, it's not possible. We know this isn't possible. Yeah, science says otherwise. And as long as we're having human babies, it's not possible.
Yeah.
Cool. There was a question from asking, when do you start to work with metrics, specifically talking about with flight level 2, and given that we start kind of where we are and pursue evolutionary change, when is a good time to start with metrics, and what is your experience on this?
I didn't start with metrics when I first started, but I don't think day one is too early to start measuring things. And that might sound scary to people because when we think of metrics, we think of this elaborate concoction of very statistical things. But I'm talking just, when did we start something? When did it finish? How many things do we have going on at one time? Those are very accessible things to start measuring. Even if you're working on, say you have a flight level 2 board on paper, you can still capture that. So I think that measuring a base level set of metrics or things that really help you see into your problems early on is good, but just measure a minimal set of things early and then grow that as you need. And don't forget to get rid of metrics when they don't serve your purpose anymore or they're not helping anymore. Then you end up causing more problems by measuring things that aren't helpful. Going back to our conversation.
But actually, when we teach flight levels, we also actually start with metrics on day one. We don't start with probabilistic forecasting on day one, but
that's sort of
yeah. But usually, I mean, doing flight levels for the sake of doing flight levels is actually quite unsexy. Usually, we want to achieve something with it, right? And for me, especially when we start, like a measurement is a kind of feedback loop where we actually try to somehow summarize or somehow find a common understanding of what do we want to achieve. So if it's about, okay, we want to improve quality, the next question, so this is the goal, what we want to achieve. So the next question would be, okay, how can we measure that we are better in quality? Does it mean less bugs? Does it mean less calls in the support center? So what is quality actually? So it's always a good conversation to have. Or for instance, we want to become agile. I love this one, right? So agility is just a balloon full of hot air, and everybody can, somehow project words into this balloon. But if you ask like, okay, what do we achieve in, let's say, 3 months that we are more, how can we see in 3 months that we are more agile? And we talk about a measurement, it's somehow getting real because we somehow need to align our thoughts. So for me, it's not only about these like lead time throughput. Metrics is much broader. And there's actually a good book from, I don't know the first name, Hubbard, How to Measure Anything. Douglas Hubbard, exactly. Thanks, Julia. How to Measure Anything, which actually goes into this direction, kind of. Yeah.
Totally agree. Everything you just said.
That's not so often the case. Thank you.
You better be careful. He's going to get used to it and start expecting it from me as well. There was a question from Tanya. She's asking, how do you take risks into account in your calculations?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I look at, depending on which, tool or app or whatever you use to do Monte Carlo simulations and generate forecasts, the interfaces will be different. But in the end, risk, the way I think about it, risk materializes in one of two ways. It changes the rate at which you can finish work, so it changes your throughput. It either increases it or decreases it if this risk comes to be materialized. Or, gosh, I just lost my train of thought. It decreases your throughput or increases it, or it changes the amount of work to be done. So a lot of times, if you have a body of work you're trying to do, and we're saying we have this risk that might materialize, if it does, it'll generate this much more work, right? Or if we have this risk that materializes, it'll reduce our capability to do work as quickly. And so those are generally two bits of the simulation that you can play with to see how they impact your forecast. And we've been talking about, I wanted to work this in, we've been talking about forecasts like you do it at the beginning and you see what the answer is, but just like in your car's GPS, it doesn't tell you, 30 minutes when you start and then come back at the end and say, yep, I was off by 5 minutes. It took you 35, right? It's continually reforecasting your arrival time. So forecasting isn't something that you should do at the beginning and then see how wrong you were at the end. It's something that you should continually check in and update based on what's happened since you last forecasted, and continually getting a new arrival date or a new forecast of how much you can finish by a certain time.
Cool. And I'm just noticing in the chat, Troy has actually pasted some of his notebooks and the little spreadsheets that he's used. His classes are awesome, by the way. If you haven't had the opportunity, I did one of them a couple of months ago. I really learned a ton about this stuff. It's really cool. But yeah, the link that he's posting. Yeah. He's funny and entertaining and really smart all at the same time, which is I think a fairly rare combination. So check out the links that Troy's pasting as well. Cool. So I want to jump across. There was a question from Sebastian. He says, do you track satisfaction, as in how happy are people working on their tasks? And if so, how does that affect the forecasting? And, he says, for me, often the human factor is missing in the metrics conversation, is kind of the subtext of it. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think satisfaction is a very integral part of what it means to be successful. In fact, when I was last an IT manager at F5 Networks, we were trying to determine what you could apply across teams to measure success, right? Because throughput's not it, and story velocity is not it, and all these things. So it's like, are we delivering value? How much value are we delivering? were the customers happy, and was the team happy? And if all those three things are happening, then I don't know how you can be more successful or successful without those things. So that said, so yes, I measure it, and it's something that you have to monitor and manage throughout time. And as you measure and manage that, you're doing better or worse, and that impacts the data that you use for your forecast. So I measure it, but it doesn't directly go into my forecast. It's an indirect attribute of, it impacts the data that then goes into my forecast. Because if my team is not satisfied, that's going to affect our output in one way or another. Either, we're burning them hard, and so it'll be really high for a while, but it's not sustainable, and then it drops off, or they're not happy, so they're doing less, even if, they're not actively trying to do that. So indirect application, but extremely important, in my opinion. What do you think, Cliff?
Yeah, I think I've definitely noticed that people pay more attention to sort of health and happiness type metrics when they're actually being kind of reported in some form or another. I think very often what happens is that people say, oh, but I talk to my people and they're all happy and everything is fine. But then if you look at some of the underlying data, I worked with a company that was doing that, but if you looked at the employee departure rate or churn rate, it was painting a slightly different picture perhaps to what they thought.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think in some ways we probably have some data, but again, it's one of those situations where you can, I'm sure I remember Troy making some joke about it, but I can't remember the exact joke, but basically that you can get a metric to essentially tell you whatever you want to tell it, or tell if you beat it long enough. And I think that's the challenge, is that if your goal is just to measure so that you can justify continuing doing exactly what you've always done, I don't know, like there's probably cheaper and easier ways to do that. Why go to all the effort of actually gathering all the metrics? But yeah, I would definitely want to see that these things are being factored in, because as you said, it's not about any one of the metrics. Like delivery is not the all important thing, and money is not the all important thing. In the same way, people's happiness is not ultimately the all important thing. I think so. We need to balance a little bit and say, we're all getting a little bit of something. What's a good balance, which is sustainable, and what's effective over the long term, rather than just a right now and a short term sort of a view.
Speaking of happiness or satisfaction, I came into work one day to our daily stand-up at F5, and someone had drawn a dramometer on the board, so like a thermometer for drama. And they were like chocolate, beer, wine, liquor, and so my goal was to always keep it down at the chocolate level, to never do the hard liquor.
I do like that. Yeah, some sort of humor coming in is usually a sign. I think I also like looking for some of those other things, like the sort of hidden indicators that things are going well. You can look for those sort of evidence, and if people feel comfortable to put some sort of a dramometer, then that's probably a good sign in my view. So yeah. Cool. So there were two questions actually. One by, I'm going to butcher your name, I'm sorry. I think it's Gregors, but there's a Z in the middle. I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce that. Yeah, Gregors is saying, in my experience, the higher flight levels have more likelihood of adjusting the trajectory of an initiative until it produces some expected outcome or value. Do you see that too? And does it make sense to forecast? So what I'm assuming is kind of underlying this question is that, we may decide to spend a certain amount of time, but then as we get closer and closer to it, we realize if we spend a bit more time, we could get more value, or maybe we just keep pursuing it for a longer period based on some information that we have. Maybe you had the same interpretation, maybe a different one, but what are your thoughts on this question? Before I kick it over to you, I want to ask the other one, which was Silke was asking, is the analysis of metrics done on flight level 2 with the same people who are collecting the data? Which I think is kind of an interesting one when you sort of combine these two concepts together. So lots of questions in there. What's your thoughts?
I think, so going back to the first one, hopefully I interpret it right. I think it's definitely more important to get your act together at flight level 3 before you try to make meaningful change at flight level 1, because anything that you try to do at flight level 1, if your flight level 3 is uncontrolled, it's just like plugging your finger in a dam. I can do things all I want and try to limit my work in process or forecast my brains out at level 1, but if the pipe is just, the water hose is just flooding in from flight level 3, I'm not really getting, I'm not going to make a lot of progress. So I think the impact of change is higher at flight level 3. But I'm not quite sure what I think about the, I think there was an element of, do you need to forecast at flight level 3? And I think that the act of forecasting is good, but the answer isn't as important as knowing what's possible and using that information into your planning. So the whole plans are useless, but planning is indispensable kind of thing. The same with forecast. Knowing how to forecast, knowing how to continually check your forecast is more important than the answer that it gives you. And you can decide to change course whenever you want. But being informed is sort of a good thing. Did I sort of go in the same direction that you were thinking of, or did you have different ways of thinking about that?
I was thinking the same sort of thing, is that if the goal of gathering some data is to be able to assess kind of the path or the direction that we're going on, I would expect us to change course in both directions. That if there's only two, but like we should decide to spend longer on something, but maybe we should also decide to spend less time on something. And this kind of connects back to what Klaus was saying at the beginning, is that if we're focusing sort of more on the value side than on, just when will it be done and how many can we get done by X, like getting more things done by X date doesn't necessarily mean they're more valuable. And usually it's the value that we're actually trying to optimize for. So let's remove the proxy, go straight to the real thing. And if we see that the value is increasing, and if we know that we can do more of it, it's going to be better off, maybe that makes sense. But if we see that the value is declining or dropping off, maybe we should shift our focus somewhere else. So I think that's quite similar to what you were saying. And hopefully that is answering Gregor's and Silke's questions. I think it's important, you need to be doing this analysis and kind of having these conversations on an ongoing basis, preferably with the people, not only who are making decisions with the metrics, but people who are actually working with the metrics and can influence the outcome in the future. It's not sort of, I wouldn't see it as something that, the CEO has a discussion and just makes a decision about the metrics and then tells the people at level 1 and 2, okay, now go and do this differently. Like, this is probably something that we could do all together. Maybe not 100% of the company, but certainly some representation from all groups could be included. Yes.
I think Sylvia's
Klaus,
question somehow fits in here. So Sylvia is asking, okay, what is the best way to share the metrics with people to help them understand the impact and whatever change they are making? Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm just collecting them. I think that they should be shared in the context of why they're being measured in a way. So if I were to take, for instance, this, I've got a Monte Carlo forecast, say from ActionableAgile on my screen right now. If I were to take this and send it to someone without any explanation, I gave them ammunition, but didn't help them point or move in a certain direction. So they need to know, if I'm sharing data with people, they need to know why it was gathered, why, what are we hoping to get by measuring this, and what we think this tells us. So I would want to give a narrative to go along with this, because the data is just part of it. The data is there to help us ask the right questions, to have the right discussions. The data in itself is not sufficient for communication. It's a starting off point. So for instance, this particular forecast tells me I have a 95% chance of, say, finishing these 100 items by October 20th based on my forecast, but that doesn't have the requisite conversation of what else I need to do. Or, oh my gosh, there's an alarm going off at my work. Sorry.
Are you safe?
So yeah, no, it's the burglar alarm. So maybe you can answer this question while I go turn that off.
Cliff, I guess that's the point where we can, You're on screen
That's
now.
an interesting one. Of all the things we think of that could possibly happen on a live stream, interruptions with an alarm is an interesting one. I mean, I think the question is probably answered, and so I'm happy to move on. We're probably quite close to needing to wrap up. So I want to do a couple of things before we take the last question. First thing I want to say is, as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, at the beginning of the live stream, we have a little bit of a special announcement for all of you. We announced actually at the last Flight Club that we were building a self-paced online workshop to teach sort of the introduction to flight levels. Some of you may already know some things about flight levels, but if you would like to maybe give it to a friend or to a colleague and share it with them, I paste the link to the sign up for the course in the chat now. It will be accessible and available basically until the end of this month. So what you're seeing now, that's the link to the course, and the code that you can use is Flight Club 20. Feel free to use that or share that with some friends. That'll give you a 20% discount on the course and a year of membership access into the flight levels community and so on. And of course, a quick reminder, if you're enjoying this content, please hit the subscribe button, share this with your friends, hit the like button as well would also be really cool. It's a cool way for us to know what content you're enjoying. We can actually even see at what point in the content you liked it, and that gives us some information to do forecasting of what to do next. Before we jump across to the last question, I wanted to just share, I see that Julia is now back,
Julia's
and
back.
I'm assuming that everything is either safe in your office or it's all gone, in which case we shouldn't worry anyway. Probably
and you're still muted.
The first one.
We're good. Yeah.
Awesome. Julia, you had something you wanted to tell us before we take the last question. Just to give us, there was an opportunity to get some access to some of your services for folks who are interested. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I have a slide that I wanted to share because there's a promo code. So there's lots of options for doing metrics, and one of those for flow metrics and probabilistic forecasting is ActionableAgile Analytics. You can go to analytics.actionableagile.com and have a free trial, but I have a promo code, MU-2020 for Meetup 2020, and that'll give you either 2 months free of our monthly subscription or 20% off a yearly subscription. So you're more than welcome to try that. But also, I wanted to let people know about our newsletter. So 55 Degrees is my company that creates Actionable Agile software now. And we have newsletters to subscribe to. So if this kind of information is interesting to you and you want to read more or learn about events that talk about this, please subscribe. And we won't spam you, I promise.
Cool. So before we close off, I want to ask one last question to Julia, and then we're going to say thank you and goodbye to everyone. So we've talked about a lot of different things about metrics and forecasting and using data and all of this. What's something from the past that you would do differently? Or maybe you have a tip that you want to offer to folks who are just starting out. You have some experience and so on. So what would you do differently based on what you know now?
Yeah, I think what I would do now, or what I would do based on what I know now, is understand the difference between uncertainty and certainty, and look at, earlier on for things that help me in uncertain environments. And also what Klaus had said about starting metrics from day one, because it helps you really think through what you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve and what that would look like if it's achieved. And when I started, I sort of went by the seat of my pants and said that felt good, and we didn't measure things a lot. So now I wish I had that story, those data points to tell people and to use as data for future change. So those are the things that I would suggest, or that I do differently than I did before, for sure.
Awesome. Cool. So I want to thank you so much for joining us. It's been lovely to chat to you, not only during the live stream, but also the preparations call. I hope that at some point we get to see each other again in person fairly soon. So thank you so much for taking the time and for joining us today. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Sure. And to everybody on the live stream, thank you so much for joining us. If you go to our meetup page, you will see there's a number of events that are actually listed. We haven't started aggressively promoting them yet. Aggressively promoting them, you know what I mean. But basically, they are listed there. If you would like to sign up in the meantime, we'll be announcing them more. We'll probably have a couple more sessions over the next few weeks before we close off for Christmas and the New Year. So looking forward to sharing the rest of our content and what's coming with Flight Club. So from me, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.
Yeah, goodbye from my side, and thank you so much, Julia, for joining us. So we actually we never met in Europe, did we? I can't remember. So we met all the time, just in Seattle, in Florida, and everywhere. So you're getting closer to Austria. So maybe we have a chance to meet in person somewhere in Europe soon. Would be really cool.
Corona, yep.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much, everybody. And yeah, I guess that's it.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.